Welcome back to Petty Astrology. I'm your host, Kaycee Felton-Lui, and I have been recovering from the Leo full moon we had last week. I don't know about you. Full moons are already big energy, and it's a time where you might have certain breakthroughs or realizations or revelations, and this full moon opposed Pluto in Aquarius, which we've been talking quite a lot about on the podcast. And then while the moon was still full, because remember, it's not a one and done thing, it's lasts for a few days, we had Uranus go direct. Uranus, my anus, our anus, whatever. We've all been experiencing a lot of energy changes, and for me, a lot of that has been about things like this podcast, which I love making. It is a lot of work, it is a lot of responsibility, and it's a new thing for me. It's not something that I've really done before, talking to people in this way. Producing a show every single week where I put hours of time into the editing, social media, promotions, not to mention all the other work I do, and I do it gladly. I love being a writer, I love being an astrologer. And I love having a place to say the things I want to say about astrology and share it with people and give them tools and insights, because what is the use of me having this information and just keeping it all to myself? But it's been a shift for me, and Capricorn season has been this slow, steady build. I've had to change a lot of things about my life, my perspective on myself, what parts of myself I think are worth sharing, or my routine has changed, my sleep has changed. The people I'm interacting with on a regular basis is changing. And it's all in service of this greater path that I'm on, this bigger thing that I'm trying to build for myself. For more than a decade, I've worked in an industry where you have to be chosen most of the time to get ahead. You make things so that people will come to you and finance you so that you can actually make more things that you want to make and, actually survive and pay your bills. Leo energy is also about taking risks. And this is a risk. This is a risk what I'm doing now, is producing my own content, connecting directly to an audience without a big corporation being the intermediary. Because it wasn't until recently that I saw that I had other options. It was this kind of Uranian energy where I broke through this idea that I needed somebody else, some larger entity or group, to be able to tell me that I could make what I want to make. So it's not that I've compromised my goals or sacrificed my creativity or my dreams, but Uranus energy is about paving new pathways. It's about thinking, hey, maybe I don't need to do things the way that I've always been told they must be done. If you look around and notice how many people in your life are having things happen to them that should never happen, they are getting laid off, they are getting illnesses, they are not making as much money as they should be making for the work that they're doing. We're seeing all kinds of examples of the ways that we have been let down. And for people like me, and maybe people like you, we're looking around and we're seeing the things that we've been told are quote-unquote safe are not so safe after all. So maybe taking some risks isn't looking so bad right now. If we do things the way we've always done them, we're just kind of sitting ducks, right? We're waiting to be chosen. We're going along with the tide of life and just hoping some beautiful decision maker decides that we are worthy. And this is not me saying that that is a bad thing to do, right? A lot of us do that. It's okay. We are surviving a very complex and terrible system, so we're going to have to do things that we don't love. But right now, those of us who spent a lot of our Uranus retrograde thinking about how we as individuals can actually impact the collective as we are experiencing these big shifts, how we can make things better, this is probably a time where you're feeling the urge to actually get down to business. We've had enough time to reflect and wonder and build up to it. And hopefully that Leo full moon helped you blow through any blocks, the places where you're limiting yourself. It's not someone outside telling you that you can't or putting their hand on your head as you try to run forward. Sometimes that person is us. I get it. I had a hard time seeing myself as someone with enough authority to have a podcast like this. I wasn't even sure people would want to listen. But then I was thinking about it and I was like, every dinner party that I've ever been to, or even back in the day, the parties, I would always end up in some corner talking to someone, having this weird, deep conversation in the background of everything. Like I am an ideal dinner party guest. that just dawned on me. Like, so why wouldn't people want to listen to my podcast? So imagine if I had listened to that voice. Imagine if I hadn't done it anyway. So my hope is that you're taking advantage of this Aquarius energy. You're noticing where things don't really have to be a certain way anymore. The times are changing. What if that was a great thing? What if it meant you could stop holding yourself back and actually get to work on something? Try it out. Make some new connections. Give yourself permission to be experimental. Do things that excite you, and maybe stuff that even freaks you out a little bit. It's okay to have doubts sometimes and question yourself and wonder if you did the right thing at all. But if it is stuff that you're truly passionate about, things that have real meaning to you and that connect you to other people in an authentic way, acknowledge those feelings in some way. Maybe talk about them on your podcast, but don't let them make decisions for you. Today on the podcast, I talk to community organizer and podcast host Albert Corrado. Then I answer a question from the Petty Astrology Advice Hotline. We've got my friend Albert Corrado here on the podcast today. Al is a community organizer. He's got 3 podcasts, so he's beat me just straight to hell. And just like a cool, funny guy.
I appreciate that. Thanks for having me on. And yeah, I do 3 podcasts, none of which make money. So that's always a fun thing to do. Just spend all of my time editing podcasts and recording them and not getting any money out of it. But I listen, I'm in it for the love of the game. So
Exactly. Do you consider yourself like a spiritual girly, Al?
Not really. I feel like my whole life I've been trying to access that kind of part of my brain or my life. And I grew up with parents who were loosely Catholic. And I mean really loosely Catholic. Like they were, we went to church a few times. I think they wanted to try to instill something in me and my sister, and we never really took to it. But my parents also just weren't like, I knew they believed in God, but they weren't trying to live that life. They weren't trying to like instill anything in us other than just like try to be a good person and don't be a dick or whatever. But so my whole life has just kind of been trying to figure out why people are spiritual, I guess, because for me, in my times of like intense grief or intense peril or whatever, so the dark times, I feel like I want to be connected to something bigger, but I just have always felt so empty with what the kind of spiritual world offers me. I went to a therapist right after suffering like a huge loss, and he was telling me like, oh, we'll try to find some comfort in God. And I was just like, I'm not here to do that, man. Like, I'm trying to get some practical advice for this, and you're giving me something that I have been told my whole life and has just always made me feel really sort of empty and cold. And so I don't know. I don't necessarily like that I'm like that way, but like I would like to have something to look towards or look up to or whatever. But as of yet, in my 35 years, I've never found anything that really made me feel anything other than maybe more confused than I was at the beginning,
Yeah, I feel you on that. I was a very similar sounding way prior to, I think it was like 2021. So I'm very recently spiritual. And I'm still an atheist. So it's like, it's kind of funny because I grew up evangelical Christian. And so I had a very specific and narrow idea of spirituality and God. And so I got really like turned off from the whole thing. And I didn't really like connect with anything in that way. So I completely relate to that. And I think it was the pandemic starting, and it really kind of shifted my perspective, because prior to that, I had been doing different kinds of community work over the years. And that was kind of what connected me beyond myself. That was the thing that I felt connected to. And it was this sense of like hopelessness and just seeing that the world needed to change so desperately with what we were dealing with, and feeling like I wasn't really sure how that could happen. And that's sort of how I ended up in this space, because I met my mentor and she has a very similar like kind of worldview to me in a lot of ways. And it kind of married the political and the spiritual for me in a way that has been very constructive for me. So I get that.
Yeah, I would say I'm still pretty atheistic. I was like kind of a shithead teenager who was like, I'm a big atheist. I started the atheist club in high school. So I have those tendencies still. But like, I definitely am kind of more open to the idea of like of a sharing energy. To me, that is kind of the only thing that I found to make some sort of sense. I'm like, like, yeah, you can't create energy, you can't destroy it. Maybe when someone passes or whatever, they release it back to the world and it imbues people around people. So that for me, that's kind of my only way where it does bring
Mm,
me a little bit of comfort, but I'm still surrounded by people who, I have a friend who's Mormon. I have friends who grew up Catholic. I grew, my brother is a born again Christian as of like 6 years ago. And so, he doesn't really try to push it on me because we've had discussions in the past. And so he kind of knows like it would kind of go nowhere. But yeah, I don't know. For me, I'm just still being an atheist and being like not a believer in sort of the general sense of what religion and spirituality is nice, but it does sometimes kind of scare me to be like, okay, I do believe that maybe this is all there is, but it's also
mm,
kind of a bummer, like there's a part of me that wishes that I could turn off the part of my brain that's skeptical and just say, yeah, you know what, I believe in this, and there's something beyond this world where I'm gonna go if I'm a good person. Even if I'm not a good person, I'll still go because someone up there loves me. But I just don't have that, and I do sort of envy people who can just kind of like throw caution to the wind and say, yes, I believe in this, and I'm going to live with the comfort of that, because it's scary to be alive. Because you think about, you lose someone, people die, and it's like, oh, that's it, you're done, and there's no, you don't exist anymore, they don't exist anymore, and I think the permanence of that is what scares me. But by that same token, I'm like, well, I had no consciousness before I was born, I'll have none after I die, so maybe there's a weird comfort in that. So I kind of vacillate between various existential crises on either end of the
mm.
spectrum.
It's good to have one of those every once in a while, I think.
Definitely.
I have your chart because I was supposed to be on your podcast and I was going to read your chart there, but now I have it here. So it's funny that you said that energy can't be created or destroyed. That's a big basis, I think, for the way that I practice astrology, because what we're looking at is energy and it's just in a chart form. And so it is interesting to me, like your spirituality or like lack of spirituality as far as your perspective. Like, I think that you are a really intuitive person. Just like looking at your chart, I could see you kind of just feeling what to say, what to do, and just kind of feeling through
Hmm.
it and feeling what is right. So I feel like in that sense, you are really connected in that way. Like, I feel like you probably are really receptive in the sense that, you walk into a room and you can pick up on the vibe.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I talk a lot in front of people, and so I never have anything prepared. And so I think one of my talents is just kind of going and like, I'll maybe have like, if I'm talking in front of a group of people, I'll like maybe have an ending that I want to hit, and then kind of work my way through that. And so sometimes when I go up and speak, I'm like, oh, that was awesome, and I really hit all the things I wanted to. And but again, it's never, I never have a piece of paper. I'm like not really good at like reading from a thing in front of people and making it sound compelling. So I just kind of go for it,
Yeah.
and a lot of times it works. And then sometimes I'm very critical of like, oh, I should have done this, or I should have said this, or I should have followed this thought or whatever. But I do think I have a tendency to kind of like see what the vibe is, read it, and see how to kind of then act in that vibe and try to meet it, and then perhaps try to heighten something. And so I don't want to be one of these people who's like, especially like there's a whole thing of like dudes like, oh, astrology is like so fake and so whatever. But like, to me, I think that ultimately what everything boils down to is that everyone's trying to look for answers as to why anything happens, whether it's good or bad or whatever. It's just like we tend to look around us for what the answer is, and it makes sense that people would look up, they would look at nature, they would look at some sort of book or
Mhm.
whatever. So when I hear that stuff, I'm like, oh yeah, I am that kind of person, and it's kind of nice to think that like maybe there's some other sort of thing that has imbued me with that energy, as opposed to just me existing that way or whatever.
Well, let me explain a little bit about like what astrology is, because, it started thousands and thousands of years ago. It's pretty much, as old as human beings are, looking up at the sky. And, we didn't have a TV. We
Yeah.
didn't have 3 podcasts to do. So we were looking up and noticing, hey, when that person was born, that constellation was there. And it's basically been thousands of years of data collection. To me, it is more accurate than economics, even, because that is a bunch of data
Hmm.
sets
Hmm.
and analysis. It's just much, much older. So it's really just like a map of the sky at the moment that you were born. And the idea is that the energy of the moment that you were born manifests physically through you. So that's what like an astrology chart is. That's what like all this stuff is. And it's really quite bizarre because like it shouldn't work as well as it does, but I can't tell you how many times that's what my job is. I sit down with strangers and I look at their chart and then I sit and tell them all about themselves, and they're usually like kind of freaked out by it, even if they're interested in it, right? Like they've bought a reading, they're sitting with me and they're like, oh my God. So I agree, it's like, it's weird, it should not work. It's weird that it works as well as it does. I was just as surprised as anyone else that I was like, oh, in terms of like the humanities, it's the most humanity as far as I'm concerned, because it combines like any kind of human knowledge and study that you can possibly do in one subject. That was interesting to me as somebody that was kind of new to it in the way that I found it, because I thought it was like, you know, the horoscopes and like a magazine, and that was my exposure to it, was kind of this lighter, less, you know, detailed version of astrology. So
yeah, it's interesting how that if they get things like that get boiled down to the most commodifiable thing. It's like, hey, we're gonna take like these things that like are really big and meaningful, and we're gonna boil them down to like a part in the newspaper where like people are gonna go and try to get some meaning out of that. And it's always funny to me because I would read those growing up and be like, okay, like I'm gonna try to believe in this, and then it's just like, I don't know, it just, to me, and I think that's what people look at when they try to dismiss this as a legitimate thing, where it's like, well, it's not just horoscopes, it's way deeper than that. And to me, it makes more sense than like some other things that people maybe believe wholeheartedly. I'm like, to me, looking at the stars and trying to make sense of the world makes more sense than like looking at a book written by a bunch of men, you know, whatever. It's the all this fucking thing in the book. When you were like an evangelical kid or whatever, would you have thought that this stuff was like demonic or you know, somehow evil?
Even though I was so in the evangelicalism, because it was like half of my family was evangelical, and then the schools that I was sent to for most of my life were also evangelical. So I was really like, it was just all around me. I was kind of taught stuff like that, not specifically about astrology. I don't remember like that stuff really coming up, but I pushed back on a lot of those ideas. Like, I remember, you know, talking about people being gay. Like that was a huge topic when I was early in high school, and people were really, you know, trying to get it in our heads that like being gay was evil. And I always felt like that didn't make sense to me. So I didn't totally accept like all of that stuff, and that was kind of the resistance that, as I became an older teenager, allowed me to distance myself from it completely. So I like things like psychics and mediums probably would have been more something that I had heard about, but it was weirdly not like a part of my life. It really didn't. But I knew that I was a Scorpio, and I knew that made sense to me in just the most basic way. That was all I really knew at that point. And it felt light enough from what I knew, like, because it's a thing that you find in magazines, that it really wasn't that big of a deal. So.
And you were growing up in the San Fernando Valley, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's where you were? Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, I know.
I always forget, like, you know, everyone's like, oh, LA is like so godless and liberal. And I'm like, but there's like churches everywhere. And like people in the valley are like more conservative than people over the hill. It's just very weird that we have that reputation.
Yeah. Well, the evangelical part of my family is in Orange County, of course.
Of course. That's why they all are, you know?
And then my schools that I went to, it was evangelical and in the valley. So it's definitely here in LA for sure. It was a very intense evangelical school in a certain way. Like we weren't even allowed to dance because that was too much. So it was, very intense. Conservative. Yeah. I remember we even had like, we would have chapel. I think it was like weekly or maybe every other week. I can't remember, but I remember we had a special chapel where they like took us out of class for several hours to tell us all about how being gay was bad in the Bible. And that's when I went home and I was like, please switch my school. And I did move schools. I went to a Catholic school after that, and it was a relief.
But what you're saying is that you can rock like a really long skirt is what you're saying. You have that ability.
I wish that the uniform at the Catholic school was better than it was. It was the worst. I was so pissed off because I was like, one, I was relieved to get out of the evangelical school, but the bummer was that it was the ugliest uniform for any Catholic school I've ever seen, because we were in, I don't know why, but like our skirts were khaki.
Oh God.
Just like absolutely ugly. And then we had white or burgundy polos only. That was our options. I was like, why do we look like fucking shit compared to every other Catholic school is like miles better than what we have. Miles better. So I took some hits to get away from the evangelical stuff, but
it was all worth it in the end. Now you're hosting a podcast. We're successful people,
yeah, exactly. So I love that you love Los Angeles so much and that you're so proud of it.
Yeah, it's a city that, it's like my hometown, so I have things that I don't like about it. I've moved away before because I was like kind of fed up with it. And I always tell people, I'm like, whether you grew up in a big city or a small town or whatever, like the place you're from, you're always going to have complicated feelings. You're going to want to get away for some time. So I've moved, I've lived in San Francisco and Oakland and Las Vegas and Minneapolis. And a lot of those times were kind of brought on by like, oh, I'm so tired of LA. Let me get out of here. But, I had to come back in 2018 and really was, realizing how much I loved LA, how much I love the San Fernando Valley, how much I just love the people here and the vibe and how real it is. Because LA, I think, gets lumped into this thing of like, oh, well, everyone's so fake and flaky. And I'm just kind of thinking like, the people that I grew up with who grew up here, who are from here, who do not work in the entertainment industry, who are not trying to like make it, they're real ass people, right? There's a lot of people who are just working class people who don't give a fuck about what's going on in Hollywood or over there. They're just trying to live their life. And so for me, this is a city that, has taught me so much, that I care about. I do a lot of work trying to make it better. And, I can talk shit about it because I've earned that right. But ultimately, to me, this is like where I want to be. It's where I was raised. I want to have a family someday. And so like, I want to raise my kids here. And like, I think it's also just like culturally significant, historically significant. I think it sort of looms large in the national. It's obviously New York, LA, and a few other cities, but I think LA is such a place where it's a misunderstood place, but it's also, people talk shit about it, but also the most amount of people around the country and around the world want to come here. And so having grown up in Los Angeles, for me, it's kind of a bragging rights of like, oh, I grew up in a place where people like aim to come and move to, and they dream of coming there, where I just got to live here and do my own thing. And so for me, that was a point of pride to be like, oh, you know what? Like people are going to come here as they do. They're going to try to make it. Maybe they're going to move back home, but I'm of this place. I'm moving through it. I'm of it. It taught me everything. And even if I leave, it's always going to be a part of me. And I'll, when I'm in Los Angeles, when I'm in the Valley, I feel like full strength, like I'm like, I fucking rule these streets, man. Like I feel like some sort of energy is in me where I'm just like, yeah, these are my streets. This is where I'm from. And I don't really feel like that anywhere else.
I feel the same way. I feel like this immense loyalty to Los Angeles. And like you were saying, so many people do come here and it's their dream to come here, and they have other, reasons for it, industry usually, or whatever it is that they're trying to make it doing. And I feel like what I've seen in, my adult life is a lot of people that come here end up not understanding the complexities of the city. And that's where we get like the gentrification happening and like people moving in and they don't like the poverty that they see and the suffering that they see. And so instead of like working to make it better, they're like, hey, actually, how can we like remove these people from our site? And it feels very colonial in a lot of ways, the way that people come here. And then I've had issues in my own neighborhood with people who definitely didn't come from here. And they're very angry about things like people being unhoused. And then they get involved in this really negative way in community. And so I feel like as somebody that is from here, I feel this pull to defend the parts of LA that to me are just a part of it. Like the fact that there are a lot of working class people here and right now are facing a lot of economic hardship. And God forbid that the city just becomes a bunch of wealthy people that moved here and pushed everyone else out.
I mean, yeah, and listen, even the word, the gentrification, the gentry would go forward and like and take stock of what was going on and report back. So like even that word just has these problematic ties, and it's interesting when people come here and try to talk shit about it, and then also try to be like, well, it's fake, well, it's this, and they want to bring whatever they want to and sort of say, oh, well, LA has no culture. And I'm like, so I've heard people say that, and that really gets to me because I'm like, we're one of the most culturally diverse places in the world. There's so many kinds of people living here. But I think people who say that are people who don't like or understand the cultures that represent Los Angeles. It's like they want to bring their monoculture, their homogenous bullshit to LA and make it look like every other place. Whereas, I live in Filipino town. And, to the right of me is Echo Park. To the left of me is Koreatown. In front of me is Little Ethiopia. Like it's such a place that's so vibrant. But I think people try to boil it down because it's easier to categorize things like that. It's easier to, if you're having problems in your life, if you feel lonely or isolated or whatever, you want to blame it on where you are. Everyone's like, oh, LA is such a lonely town. And I'm like, so I grew up here, so I already have a built-in social network or whatever. But I'm just like, I moved to San Francisco and made friends right away. And maybe that's just who I am. The Libra in me is just like gregarious and fun or whatever. But like, I moved to Minneapolis and had I was there for only 4 months and had a group of people that I was hanging out with. But I just kind of think like, if you come to LA and you feel like it's not for you, it's kind of user error at that point. Like, this city has so much shit that it can offer you. If you're not finding your people or your community, whether it's comedy or theater or whatever the hell you're into, I kind of feel like you're just not trying hard enough, or you're taking what people say about Los Angeles and convincing yourself that it's true, because I've never had a problem, but again, I'm from here, so I can't necessarily speak to it as an outsider. But I just think people just don't try hard enough, or they want to believe that like somehow LA is the reason for all their problems, rather than maybe it's kind of on them a little bit. Again, cities can be unfriendly, and sitting in your car all fucking day isn't great, but you got to try a little harder, I think.
There is so much here. I think people that haven't been here and really like lived in it don't quite understand exactly how diverse it is, exactly how many different neighborhoods there are. Like, I think it's really hard to even wrap your head around, because LA is so big and spread out. There is just so much to offer. I completely agree with you. I'm like, I don't understand what there is to complain about, unless this is not your vibe. I'm not surprised, looking at your chart, that you haven't had a difficult time making friends wherever you've gone. You've got I know this is going to be some astrological terminology that
this is great. I love it.
My audience is going to be like, okay, I kind of know what that means. And you're going to be like, I don't know what that means. So I'm going to try to translate it for you.
Okay, sure.
You have your South Node in the 11th house in Virgo. And so to me, that tells me, like, from my perspective, I would look at that and say, hey, maybe Al has some past lives where he was heavily involved in like community work, or you kind of came into this life with the skills to build community and just kind of innately and intuitively understanding community. And you also have your Venus in the 11th house as well. So like, that just screams to me like the ability to build connections and really get on people's level in this kind of broader community way. So I think all of that is very natural to you. And you have an Aquarius moon as well. So I think just your ability to connect to so many different kinds of people and just relate to people human to human, I think is just on an emotional level for you extremely natural. And then, of course, you've got all that Libra energy as well. So I just feel like you really know how to connect with people and see things from their perspective, even if it's not your perspective. So I can see why, like, you've been so successful you just know a lot of different people and have a lot of different connections.
I've always been, in elementary school, I had a big group of friends. I was like, I saw myself as sort of a leader of sorts with my friend group and stuff. It's like really my quest for attention is what it kind of all comes down to. Like, I love attention. I love people knowing me. I love people talking about me. I have a reputation in Los Angeles, I think, in certain circles of being militant, whatever, and there's a part of me that really revels in that. I think there's a part of me, the vulnerable part, where it's like, it's never like super fun when people dislike you. I'm a person who wants love and affection. So sometimes that can really, can weigh on me. But a lot of the time I lean into this thing of like, I'm like good at what I do. I go hard, for the things I care about. And if you're not in line with that, then I don't really fucking care. And so I do. Again, and the thing is, I just want to, ultimately I want to be on people's minds. And so I think my whole life has been kind of defined by trying to bring enough people into my life that I have different experiences and perspectives. And I think one thing that I've always kind of tried to foster in my life is trying to bring people in who are on the outside of the circles. I always look for people when I was in elementary school and high school and even in my regular life, like this person who like is maybe shy and maybe trying to like be part of a group or connect with people. And I try to bring them in. And it happened as early as elementary school, where like this one kid who was seemingly kind of weird and was maybe a little like isolated and wasn't really kind of part of any of the friend groups. I was like, hey, come and hang out. And like, you're met with resistance sometimes because they don't know what your intentions are, and they don't really know how to engage with it. But ultimately, like once you kind of show them like, hey, I'm just trying to be your homie, like I think you would benefit from like having friends. And so I always kind of was that person who like had my friend group, and I could roll with, the cool kids to a degree. I knew people who played sports. I knew some of the rocker kids. I knew some of the, highly gifted magnet nerds or whatever, because I like to just roll in different circles. And,
Yeah.
I can talk about, a little bit about sports. I can talk about, a little bit about literature and other things. And so for me, social cachet is really important to me. And so I want to be able to go to a party, and if it's a bunch of comedians, I'm down to chat and riff. If it's a bunch of people who are more academic, I never went to college, but I know a thing or two. I can talk, I can fake it till I make it a little bit, but I'm always
Yeah.
trying to foster connections. I'm always trying to build something, because I think ultimately I want to be known, I want to be loved, I want to be cared for, but I also really love to take care of people, and I want to make people feel loved and wanted. And so I'm always trying to be like, hey, I want to be there for you. If you want to be there for me, that's cool. No pressure, but also like, just think of me, just have me on your mind, because to me, the worst thing in the world would be to like not have any attention on me. And I think, maybe that has something to do with my placement, or it could be. Let me ask you, actually, I'm kind of going all over the place, but I want to know something, because
Yeah.
I've always had this thought. And so you're obviously
Mm.
well versed in this stuff, but like, where does a person's trauma and what they've been through, what does that sort of play into as far as what they're naturally gifted at and what their placement kind of makes them into? How do those things coincide? Because I've always wondered, like, I've always been this way since I was a kid, but like, going through traumatic stuff, I think, changes me. And there's parts of me that
Yeah.
still are kind of the same, but I know that those things kind of change me. So how do those things play together?
One of the things that astrology has given me is that I've looked back on a lot of the traumatic events in my life, and I can see how those moments shifted the direction that I was going in. And I always look at those things like, they happened, so there's nothing that we can't undo them. So
Yeah.
from my perspective as an astrologer, I'm looking at those things as like, what did you get out of it? And that's my Scorpio energy, because the energy of a Scorpio is very like hard to kill kind of a thing. Like,
Okay.
I'm going to take everything good, bad, ugly, and I'm going to see what I can do with it. So I kind of approach astrology in that way, because a lot of us have dealt with different forms of trauma. And I don't ever want people to feel like that is the most interesting thing about them in terms of astrology, because sometimes that is how people focus their astrology. They will focus on like, oh, I can see that this negative thing happened, and, that can get all of the attention. And it's not that it's not worth the attention, but I don't like defining people by the worst things that have happened to them, but
Yeah.
those things, I think every person is going to be different. And so I think some of us, the trauma might weigh on us in a certain way. Sometimes people build an identity around their trauma,
Yeah, definitely.
and there are reasons for that, and I don't sit in judgment of it. But to me, my perspective is like, the people that I work with astrology, my point is like, I want you to like have the best life that you can possibly have. And my job is I see the toolbox in the astrology chart, and I'm like, these are the tools that we have, how can we use them? So when I look at trauma, I personally am looking at it like, what did you get from that? Like, what were the tools that you got from that? What were the realizations, the perspective shifts? And a lot of times, actually, in terms of spiritual awakenings, are something that I've been kind of talking about a lot on this season, because I think people have specific ideas of what that might look like. And I think we have a lot of different, like, big perspective shifts in our life and spiritual awakenings in our life, or some things that you could call that. And oftentimes those traumatic moments are those big perspective shifts. Those are those awakenings where, even though it's like this horrible thing has happened, there is something on a mental level, on a spiritual level, that can shift. And so I kind of look at it in those terms. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I that's a great answer. And I've always like kind of, I guess I've never had the chance to ask somebody about that, because I do
Yeah.
think like, I mean, traumas change you, and but I guess maybe it's like whatever you are, or whatever your placements are, like,
Hmm.
I guess it's sort of that is going to inform how you react to the trauma
Yeah.
and how it sort of changes you. And so because I've always, I've been through a lot of shit in my
Hmm.
life, and so sometimes I'm like, I'm always stuck with this question of like, can we ever really change? Are we tied
No,
to?
we are not tied to it.
Yeah.
In fact, I think that's a big thing that it's so important for people to understand about astrology, because free will is 100% a part of it, right? Like, you have a choice of like, this is the energy that you were born with. But it's like music, actually. That would be probably a good metaphor for you, especially because I know that you love music so much. But
Yeah.
each placement, each side, it's like a musical note, and so sometimes you're going to play that Libra note at the highest note, or you're going to play a really low
Yeah.
Libra note, and that is kind of up to you. It's like, do you want to you could be dealing with like codependency, where you're like really, you're really liking the partnership and it's like maybe unhealthy, or you're at a
Hmm.
more high level where it's like you can, with the Libra energy, it's like you can see things from the other person's perspective. You're really good at coming to a compromise, so you can play those notes at different levels, and that is free
Yeah.
will.
Yeah, I feel like, and that makes sense because I have been having a lot of conversations lately about like, I guess it kind of boils down to like playing certain notes really highly and just being like, oh, like I'm staying at this, and a lot of it has to do with like interpersonal relationships and my own sort of way of like, I have a tendency to kind of write people off pretty quickly, and like, if I feel like they disrespected me, or I feel like their intentions, or what they think of me is not great, I kind of am like, okay, well, I don't want anything to do with you. Please leave my vicinity, like get out of my face, sort of thing. And I sometimes look at that and I'm like, that's a defense
Mm,
mechanism in a way. Obviously, like I don't want to get hurt or be made to feel bad or whatever. But like I then sometimes I'm like, I sometimes maybe am playing it for too long and for too loud. It's like at a certain point it becomes sort of dissonant where it's like,
mm,
okay, like yes, of course I want to protect myself, but at a certain point I need to figure out whether I'm doing this because
mhm,
self-preservation, my ego, or am I really in danger? And so I've been trying to figure out like my relationships with people who I don't necessarily
mhm,
like or I have a weird feeling towards. Sometimes I lean really into like being just kind of a shithead and be like, yeah, fuck you, like I'm out of here. And I want to be better about that because sometimes I'm like, you know what? I need to give people the benefit of the doubt more than I do, but it can be hard because I think sometimes the walls and I'm used to kind of like putting something up in front of me to protect myself after having gone through something. And I think sometimes that stays up, even if it's around people who I should be trusting and who want nothing more than to like make me feel good or love me or whatever. And sometimes I think that gets in the way. I play that note a little too long.
yeah, that's fair. Especially, if you've been through stuff, that makes complete sense. I think respect is a big thing from you. Looking at your chart, you are a Libra rising, and then you are a Libra sun and Mercury as well. So that Libra energy, I think respect is a really big thing. It's like, it's funny because one of the stereotypes with Libras is that they can be pushovers in certain ways, or they're,
Hmm.
they are too like agreeable. They can be too, but for
Hmm.
me, I have a Libra Venus, and for me, like the respect thing, if you don't kind of mind your manners, and not, I'm not concerned with how people are like holding their knives and forks. It's more just like how they behave towards me, and if people
Sure.
are,
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
people are disrespectful to me, like I'm so offended. I'm so offended. So I completely get that. You have two planets and your rising sign in Libra. So I could see like particular about you, that respect factor. And probably because I think you yourself go into a situation with a certain level of respect. So it's like, if I can do it, why can't you like meet me
Yeah.
halfway? That's kind of the Libra energy, is the meet me halfway thing. But also, again, you are really intuitive. So if you are picking up on people not being right in some way, I kind of
Hmm.
don't give in to paranoia or anything like that. But I feel like you have a pretty good handle on whether somebody is off in some way and maybe shouldn't be in
Yeah.
your energy.
Yeah, and I think that I was actually talking about this last night with someone where I'm like, growing up, my situation with my family life was filled with like inappropriate behavior from my parents, and so I think I learned how to I have a high tolerance for inappropriate behavior where I was put in situations by my parents, or where my parents were getting a divorce, and they were trying to turn me and my sister against one another. It was horrible, but like I think because of that I can really sense when someone is good because I'm like, oh, because once you realize as a kid that an adult can hurt you, and I don't, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally, you are like, oh, then every adult around me, I can't fend for myself because I'm a kid, and every adult around me can hurt me, can make me feel bad, and so then I think I learned how to actually parse through that my own feelings and say, oh, this is a good person, and I think that sometimes when I get some alarm bells about a certain person or certain people, I'm just kind of like, okay, like usually I'm right about that. And I think sometimes because I'm only human, sometimes the wires get crossed and maybe I called it incorrectly and then have to come back and say, oh, you know what, you're actually cool or whatever. But I think because I went through all that, I'm like, yeah, this is a good person because I can sense that, because I know what a bad person is like. I know what someone is like when they're putting me through something or making me feel bad. So I want to look for people who don't do that. And so I think I have a good judge of character. But again, sometimes I play the note too long where it's like I have to be, I have to be on guard with around everybody. And sometimes I'm just like, and it's happened to me in relationships where I'm like, this is a person who I'm with who loves me. Why do I think that they're trying to harm me? And that to me has gotten me into some trouble where it's like, oh yeah, I shouldn't be thinking of that about you because you're someone who I trust and love, and you wouldn't do that to me. But again, sometimes your thoughts kind of run away with you, and you start to build a narrative that isn't necessarily true.
I can see that. I can see that. Your moon is in Aquarius. It's in your fourth house, and it's square Pluto. So I can see there being a real emotional sensitivity there, and particularly because you mentioned the experience with you growing up. Like I had a similar situation in the sense I had two households, and there was
Hmm.
a lot of disagreement between the parents between those two households and the way that we do things, and it gives you a real sensitivity to just interpersonal dynamics. And I think for kids that go through that, we kind of take that with us for the rest of our lives because we're able to read into situations probably a lot more than, kids who don't have that experience, because
Yeah.
we have to kind of keep our finger on the pulse of what's going on for our own sense of security. So it's really important, and it's a good awareness to have that, that is part of like where that comes from for you. And that's another thing. It's like, that a lot of the times the things that we have that we're really good at, sometimes they don't come from like the great experiences that we had as kids.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm really good at sitting and talking about really personal things about people, which is part of what I do with astrology. And part of that is because my childhood was chaotic, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
so, everybody wins.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes with me, it's like when I was younger, I wanted someone to talk to. And so, and I had my sister who was younger, but like when we were kids, I don't know, you can be there for each other, but not in, you just don't have the tools. And so I was always looking for someone, older or whatever, to like, oh, I want someone to help me out and help me, figure out why I'm feeling this way. And so I think as an adult, I've tried to be that for people and say, hey, like, I needed someone and didn't always necessarily get that, but I want to be that to people and say, hey, like, and so the same with you. It's like I love to talk to people about deep stuff. I don't like, I can do small talk all fucking day. I can do surface level shit all day, but for me, I want to get to the nitty gritty because ultimately, I'm like, people sometimes don't want to talk about traumatic stuff because it can be, there's a lot of shame involved. There's a lot of
Yeah.
embarrassment. There's a lot of humiliation, and so I think trying to be that for people is just kind of
Hmm.
a thing that I feel like I'm meant to do because I'm like I never had it, so I want to give it to people, and then because I'm also getting something out of it too. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Because if the reciprocity is there, I can just talk to them about what I'm going through, and we're both kind of benefiting from that situation.
For you, with that, you have a 12th house Libra Mercury, and I feel like for you it's like nothing is off limits in a certain way, and not that you don't have
Yeah.
boundaries, but I feel like you can kind of go wherever, especially on a mental level.
That is like so very much on the nose, like
Yeah.
on the nail. Yeah, I'd say I'm not a private person really. I'm not a person who like hides
Yeah.
anything. I'll really like talk about because I'll take it to a place sometimes if I feel comfortable. But if a person kind of gives me the green light of like, oh, I want to talk, I'm like, let's fucking go, let's do it, let's
Yeah.
get into it. And I'm just looking for that kind of consent of like, oh, if we're gonna talk about deeper stuff
Hmm.
and maybe stuff that's gonna get a little dark or whatever, I'm always down to do it because I think that's where I kind of play best is like because my life has been filled with so much trauma that I'm like I find it easy to go into a dark place and not even necessarily in a way of getting depressed. It's more just like allowing those thoughts to come in and dealing with them and talking about this uncomfortable dark stuff because I have spent so much time in the abyss that I'm just kind of like very acquainted with it, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. You can see that in your chart too. I feel like the things that are more private, a little bit more below the surface, aren't off limits for you because you've probably had experience, in those areas. And you have a Aries Mars. It's a 0 degree Aries Mars. So It's funny because you were talking earlier about how like you've been considered militant, and you have your own very specific way of doing things, and you kind of don't care who gets in the way of it, especially when it comes to moral issues. I feel like because when you're aligned with your morality, and I feel like you act off of your morality as well. It's like, this is what I believe, this is what I stand for, and it's just very natural for you to just go for it.
Yeah.
I feel like it just in a lot of ways you are who you are, and I love that the darker kind of more intense things in life that I think some of us are less comfortable with. I feel like that's kind of where you're very comfortable living.
Yeah, no, I mean that is definitely who I've been for a very long time, and it's just because when you go there, and then you're like, okay, you sort of find a comfort in those things too.
There's a fearlessness that I see. Like, I just don't see you being put off by things because they're difficult or scary or uncomfortable. Maybe just like other people consider them difficult, uncomfortable, or scary. I just don't think it works the same way for you. You have been a community organizer for a while now, yeah?
Well, a little over 5 years, yeah.
A lot of people that listen to my podcast are interested in mutual aid and community building and haven't necessarily had the experience to kind of get started. What do you advise for people that are kind of coming to it new?
One of the things I learned early on was like I had to figure out what I really cared about. Like there is so much stuff that's wrong. There's so many things that you can do, so many avenues to go down to help and whatever. There's so much need. There's homelessness. There's obviously the policing stuff. There's tons of like inequity around us. And so you have to figure out boil it down to 2 or 3 things that are most meaningful to you that you want to help out with, and then kind of try to figure out where you fit into that. So when I came to the movement, I was fucking broken and was like, I don't know, I want to be part of something. I want to help people out. I want to take on the systems of oppression that exist in the city and in every city. I was like, okay, what do I really care about and what am I good at? And ultimately, every movement needs different perspectives, different people doing different things. And so if we're talking about community organizing, political organizing, there's a lot of need for everything. We need people to write stuff. We need people to do videos. We need people to make, art and propaganda and all that stuff. And so find out what you really care about, the things that you really want to put your mind to. Because again, you can sit there and volunteer at 10 different places and not feel like you're really making a difference. So if you put your time and energy into a few things, you can really love it and care about it and foster some relationships and, kind of be really effective in helping out. So if you're a graphic designer, we fucking need tons of graphics for social media. We need it for posters to kind of carry the message over. If you're like me, I was kind of like, I don't know what my talents are. I don't know if I belong in this movement, but I know that I have a passion for what's going on. I care about homelessness. I care about policing and police violence and stuff like that. So what am I good at? And I said, I'm actually pretty good at conveying a point to people. I've been public speaking since I was in 2nd grade. I was in plays and I love the good book report. Like that's what I'm good at. So I'm going to go and offer my services to an organization. I'm going to go, if you need me to go on a podcast, you need me to go in front of a TV camera, I can keep it concise and effective. That's what I can offer to the movement. And I think people get caught up in like, oh, well, do I belong here? I didn't read theory. I'm not, I wasn't political. And like, I never read theory. I never went to college. I found myself in a place where I needed to get involved for my own soul and my own mental health. And so I thought, you know what, let me figure something out. Let me go to some meetings for some organizations that sound cool. The internet's a great resource if you want to look up your city and what's going on there. If you're whatever, your politics and your leanings, look up, groups that are working in those spaces. Go to a meeting, hang out, get to know people. It's a social club as much as anything. You're going to find people who you like. There's dynamics, there's whatever. That's the thing you have to navigate too. But ultimately, don't be afraid to get involved because you don't know where you fit in. Because people will tell you where you fit in. Because there's, again, so much need. And we have people who come in from the blue and just say, I want to get involved. I don't know. What can I do? And if you have good people that are leaders who kind of can sense what kind of people's talents are, you can then filter them into where they need to go. I used to be onboarding for a group called No Olympics. It's an anti-Olympic organization. I haven't organized with them for a while, but like I would bring people in, talk to them and say, what are you good at? Let me suss out what you can kind of provide for us. And so then kind of filter them into those teams. And so, and also show up being prepared to learn. Like show up and say, hey, I'm good at this and I want to, offer my services, but also humble yourself and say, that you don't know everything,
Mm.
and that you're going to meet people who are going to challenge you, who are going to try to teach you things, and be teachable and humble and say, you know what, you can stand strong and say, this is what I'm good at and I can offer this. Great, awesome. But you're going to talk to people from all various walks of life. So you need to be able to like sit there and say, I don't know everything about this, so please teach me and please, educate me on these things. And so I showed up, again, being like, I know that I believe this, I know that I believe this, and I know that I'm good at that. But also, I've never done this, so please, help mold me into a community organizer.
Yeah.
So I think being teachable and showing up and be willing to do the work, and remember that this shit is not always sexy, right? If you look at the news and you think about 2020, where it's like, oh, we're on the streets and we're protesting and all that stuff. I mean, that happens. That's part of it. You go to rallies and it's great and you're in community. But, I spent the other day, I run a community space with my friends, and I was on my computer all day, like messaging people who are part of our Patreon and trying to figure out what happened to our deliveries. And like, sometimes it boils down to just kind of making sure that things get done. And that's not always sexy, but I think you have to remember that like these movements and these things move a little bit slowly, and we're at the mercy of the systems that are in place. So sometimes it boils down to like having a meeting over Zoom that, isn't really productive, but you got to talk about it. You got to try to move on and just remember that like this stuff is, it's going to take a long time to get where we need to be,
Yeah. I love that you said that. It is so important to understand that it's a work in progress and that people have been doing this organizing for hundreds of years.
Yeah. I mean, I know people who've been in the movement for 50 fucking years, and, they've seen a lot of victories, but they've also seen a lot of setbacks and a lot of defeats. I talked to this guy, Baba Akili, who's one of the leaders of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. And we're talking a while back, and he was just saying how, every few years he had to learn the name of a Black person who was killed by the police. And he was saying, I've learned all these names, I've talked to these families. And he's like, but the first one I remember was Emmett Till, because he was, I think, 6 or 7 when Emmett Till was murdered. And, that guy's been in the movement, and he's been part of all the, he knew Malcolm X, he knew Cesar Chavez, he worked alongside these people and has made a difference. But again, in the sort of realm of like time and the sort of the bigness of all these organizations and institutions that oppress people, it's a drop in the bucket, because he can only do so much as one person. We can only do so much as people who organize in Los Angeles. I would say the LA left is probably a few thousand strong, but ultimately we're going up against, millions of people who want us dead or in jail or whatever. So, it's just like, I talked to this guy and he still has the fire in his eyes and say, you know what, I'm still in this. I'm in my 70s. People say I should retire, but I'm going to keep doing it. And I think that's what it takes to really have longevity in this movement, is to take some rest and know that like you're not always going to be on the front lines. And then again, figure out where, if you're not going to be the leader at the marches, find something else to do and still be an inspiration. And he's the guy that I go to for advice all the time. And he has so much sage knowledge, and he also realizes that, he's an older guy, and he sometimes will let people who are younger take the lead, because he's not on the streets as much as we are, right? So it's a symbiotic thing of like, we have to teach each other, and I can maybe teach this older man who's so brilliant a little something, and then he's going to teach me a lifetime's worth of shit in one conversation. Yeah. And it's amazing.
Like, I really want people to understand that when they come to any kind of community work, you're going to meet people that you probably don't care for, but you're probably also going to meet some of the coolest, most heartfelt people that you will ever meet in your life. And I think both of those are really important experiences, because the work is the work. And sometimes you're going to have to work with people that you don't necessarily want to be friends with outside of the work.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're going to make these connections that will change your life and will be part of the energy that keeps you going, because it is a lifelong commitment. We are doing work that will benefit, our children and our grandchildren, hopefully. And I think it's so important, especially like for us younger people, because we get really, I guess, excited, and we've not lived as long as somebody like Baba Akili. Yeah. It can feel like, well, we're gonna do this thing and it'll be done, and then we'll live our lives. And I think that people really need to understand that the changes that need to be made are pretty comprehensive, and it's going to take a lot of work and commitment from as many people as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say, like, just to speak on meeting people that you don't like, or and then, and by the same token, meeting people that you care about. Like, that's been my experience in this. Is like, you're working alongside people that maybe you don't get along for some reason, or maybe they're just not your kind of person, but you're doing work together. You're like, hey, this is awesome. Like, we're building something, and just because we don't necessarily aren't going to go hang out after this, like, it doesn't mean that the work is less important, or somehow your involvement in it is not important, because again, these are social clubs. They're social things that, you meet people that you like, and you maybe date them, whatever. Like, these are just, everything is a microcosm of the bigger society we live in. But one thing that I look to all the time, and that I am really proud of having done, is when you and I worked together at the mutual aid room in 2020, when the pandemic hit. It was kind of like, I met you, we didn't know each other, I found you to be a very pleasant, fun person. I would look forward to seeing you when you were volunteering. And it was like, we were doing this incredible work. We were doing something that had never been done. We were sitting there bleaching cans of creamed corn, and putting, rice into Ziploc bags and sending it out. And we were doing, for me, a very, very important, anarchistic work, sort of. We were kind of, working outside of the systems that were supposed to be helping people, and we were actually helping people. We're sending food to people when they needed it. We're sending medical supplies and all sorts of, fun stuff. And so, meeting someone like you, it's like, we've known each other for a few years. We've, hung out a few times, but like, I still have a lot of love for you, just because I know that your heart is good. And that those moments where we were doing something that no one had ever really done, we were in this weird room. I don't think we saw each other's faces for like many months,
You're all masked up. Yeah.
And then I remember just then seeing you at a march that I had for my sister in July of that year. And just being like, shit, we were working, we met working in this weird thing, and we had fun times and listened to music and chatted and all that. And then here you are supporting your community again and supporting me. And that felt really amazing. And so I think that the amount of people that I've met doing this work, 90% of them are now people I will always love and care about. A percentage of those people are now some of my closest friends who I would like die for. And so when you're doing this kind of work, you can feel good about giving back to people. You can feel good about, being involved and being educated and in something new. But also, like, ultimately, I think life is about hanging out. Like,
yes,
everything is revert. It's like, you go to work so then you can afford to hang out with your friends. You do everything just to go back to hanging out with people that you care about. And so for me, we were doing something, and we were all terrified of getting this horrible disease and dying of it. But we were still showing up for our community and showing up for each other, and like having those moments of like, levity, when it's like, man, who the fuck knows when this is going to end? Seeing someone request a bunch of stuff that we just didn't have. And I'm like, I want to get this for this person. I want to make sure that they get it. I remember buying like a birthday cake for someone who really wanted a birthday cake. And we're like, we don't normally do that, but let's fucking do it, because this is what we're trying to help people out here. And so you will meet so many cool people that you and I may never have met. And now I'm on your podcast, and it's great, but we may never have met. And now we know each other. And it's so cool that we like have that very unique experience of like, and I have that with other people. Hey, remember that we went to that rally and we almost got beat up by the cops? Or remember when we did this? And remember we're outside of the mayor's house and we got chased by a bunch of fucking Trump supporters, whatever it is. Like, you build those community memories, and those are some of my favorite memories of all time.
It is so important to remember that really it comes down to, I agree with you. Life is about hanging out. Like, the vibe sucks right now in the world, and I'm trying to improve the vibe. So I don't want to live in a world where, things are so violent and chaotic and hateful, right? It's like, I'm just like, why do we have to, why does the vibe suck so bad? Like, because some people want to be extraordinarily, disgustingly wealthy and, on the backs of the rest of us. Like, fuck that, So I think keeping that in mind, like, this is really about human connection at the end of the day. As much as there is the work and the grind, it is about people coming together, relating to each other, and, our shared humanity. It's really that. It is very simple underneath it all.
Yeah, and I mean, I always go back to, there's a great album by, my favorite band is Bright Eyes. I'm a fucking like OG sad boy, whatever. But there's an album called Casadega, and Casadega is like a little, it's like a retreat in Florida. Yeah, I'm sure you're...
It's metaphysical community.
Yeah, exactly. And so he wrote this album about it, and it starts with him. You hear someone from like a psychic hotline talking. You don't hear his voice, but you hear her kind of like giving him advice. And the whole album is about like trying to find meaning in your life. And some people, go to astrology and they talks about Ouija boards and those kind of communities where mystical communities and all that. And some of it kind of bumps up against God and religion too. But for me, it's kind of always like, we're just looking for answers, and like, you'll find those answers in community, in something like astrology, where the world starts to make a certain amount of sense. I don't think we'll ever fully figure out why the world is the way it is, but if you can find some semblance of a shape of sense, I think it makes you feel better. And so, I don't know what I necessarily believe in at the end of the day, but I know that I feel really full and fulfilled when I'm around my community, when I'm around people who have shared beliefs in good things. And when I'm around people who don't share that, it sort of sucks, but also I have to remember that they're there because of their own placements and their own sort of what they've been through. And that's, I guess, beautiful too. And trying to find beauty in what you maybe don't always like is something that's important to me. But that album to me is so important as well, because we find ourselves in moments of trauma and trouble, and you like want an answer, you want some sort of comfort. And I don't begrudge anybody who goes and tries to find comfort in anything. I think it, becomes a problem when they try to like proselytize or whatever. Again, that's my own anti-religious kind of shit popping up. But for me, it's like, hey, I want people to find answers. And if you find your answer in doing whatever, I found my life's work will be community organizing. It will be doing what I do. And I'm happy that I found it. I mean, I'm not really happy that it took a lot of the shit that I went through to find it, but I think that's just how life goes. Sometimes you're not always going to find it in a book or in a professor that you like or in a TV show, or whatever. You're going to find it sometimes in the hard way. But to me, it's like, if once you find what you're really good at or what you're meant to do, I think that really gives your life a lot more meaning. It softens the blow of having to put up with a lot of shit in life,
I feel like one of the ways that you kind of find God, if I had to guess, just like looking at your chart, I feel like you have this ability to kind of see God in everything, and the interconnectedness, the energy that's within all things. And I could see that being part of it, but I can also see in other people, you can, from my perspective, like everything that exists tells me something about the universe. Every good, bad, ugly, it's to me, it's all facets of this larger thing. So I kind of look at like God as being in everything in a way.
I'm sorry, I was going to say, I have a friend she was raised as a Quaker, and I had never really heard what the tenets of that are, but she said one of the main things was that finding divinity in every person and everything, because God is everywhere, then God is in every person. And so that's how you are kind to people, or kinder to people, is if you look at them as having God in them. And I think that makes sense to me. And again, whatever God is to you, that's, but again, if my God is the energy, then I want to make sure that I'm okay with people. And hey man, we're going to share energy at some point. My energy is going to go into you or to somebody when I die, and vice versa. So let's try to make it some good energy too,
I love that.
You have one unheard message. First unheard message.
Hi, my name is Drew. I have a question for you. I would love to hear your insight on how to better nurture my Cancer Venus that is in my 7th house. Relationships are very important to me, but they don't always feel balanced, and that can lead to feeling really unsafe. And this goes for all relationships, not just in the romantic sense. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you.
So Drew, with that Cancer Venus in your 7th house, your closest relationships, your partnerships are something that you're probably quite protective of. You need these connections to be nurturing, comfortable, emotionally supportive, mutual, fair. And the 7th house is partnerships, it's contracts, it's give and take. So I would suggest like being very clear about the contracts you're in and the expectations you and the other person have of each other. I think getting on the same page creates a safer environment, because then everybody has a chance to communicate and fulfill the terms instead of quietly expecting things and being disappointed if they don't magically happen, which is easy to do when you're close to people. For you, having relationships with people that you can communicate and work through that with is really the only way for you to do it, as far as I can see. Because like, if you don't feel safe enough to do that with someone, looking at your chart, that tells me that they probably can't meet your needs. Like, if they can come to you about something that's bothering them and you can't go to them for the same, I just don't see your Venus being satisfied. So I think it's about respecting that about yourself. Not being afraid to let go of connections that just don't qualify and investing in building the ones that actually do. Not being afraid to say exactly what it is you want and need and what your limits are, and being okay with the fact that not all relationships are forever, maybe in the way that a Cancer Venus might like them to be. And, not everyone can be everything all the time, including you. So it's also important for people to nurture more than one close relationship. So it's not like all on the one best friend you've known since elementary school, or, one romantic partner to represent all of your emotional safety with others, right? Like, I can see if you've had bad experiences in the past that it might be easy to, plan for future relationships. Like, oh, that happened to me then, so I'm going to protect myself by, assuming that it might happen again. We don't really want to do that, I think. So cultivating different relationships, I think we do a lot of learning that way, right? Like, this friendship goes this way and this other friendship goes this way. And that allows us to have a lot more acceptance for the different ways that people do relationships. We don't want to have a scarcity mindset about our ability to get close to people, because then that Venus is going to repel connection like it's nothing. And your emotions are very connected with how you relate to others. So you feeling emotionally healthy and cared for just by yourself will automatically improve the quality of your relationships and really empower that Cancer Venus to attract people that resonate, that are picking up what you're putting down. So that is always going to be a win for you, your current relationships, and your future relationships. So thanks for your question, Drew. If you would like to submit a question to the Petty Astrology Advice Hotline to be answered on a future episode, you can become a sponsor on my Patreon. The link is in the show notes. This episode was produced by Lori Rivers and Elena Tunder and brought to you by my sponsors on Patreon.